blurb. Uh, in the United States and across Europe, anti-immigrant public opinion has fueled the electoral successes of far-right populist parties. How are we to understand the rise of anti-immigrant attitudes across the global north? What drives public opinion on immigration? And under what conditions can populist far-right parties with anti-immigrant platforms score electoral victories? Professor Antje Ellermann will present an overview of research findings on the drivers of immigration attitudes and the rise of far-right populist parties. Professor Antje Ellermann, thank you for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Thank you for the welcome, Larry, and it's good to be joining you tonight. And I want to begin this meeting by acknowledging that I'm joining from the shared and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples who have been caretakers of these lands since time immemorial. And I also want to acknowledge that I think most of us are joining this meeting with a heavy heart tonight, thinking about what is happening in Ukraine and the war having returned to Europe. And my thoughts are certainly with the people of Ukraine, also with their families abroad who are going through turmoil, watching this from afar. So it's hard to sometimes just move on with life while these things are happening. But I just want to be mindful that that's certainly something that I think is everybody's thinking about. And there's obviously a connection to immigration in the sense that we're seeing this enormous refugee flow now out of Ukraine as people seek safety, as women and children seek safety. So I'm gonna share my screen with you. Give me just 1 second. So the title of my presentation is Understanding Immigration Attitudes and the Rise of Far-Right Populism. And feel free to interrupt me if there is anything that, as I'm speaking, I'm not sufficiently clear about. I don't have a problem with being interrupted. To give you a bit of an idea of what's in store tonight is I want to start out talking about public opinion on immigration in terms of an overview. What does the research tell us in terms of what the patterns are and how people think about immigration and immigrants? Then I want to move on to talking about what we know about the determinants of these attitudes. Why is it that people think the way they do? And then the last part of the presentation will focus on the rise of far-right populist anti-immigrant parties, with a particular focus on Europe, where this has been particularly pronounced phenomenon over the past couple of decades. So let me start out just providing you with an overview in terms of patterns that we see across countries. And I'm talking here about countries of the global north or the West, North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. So just to bear that in mind. And the first thing to say about immigration attitudes is that in most countries, the majority of the public has restrictionist views on immigration. And by restrictionist, I mean that they support or they want lower levels of immigration. So it's very rare to see strong support in favor of increasing levels of immigration. And I'm going to throw a lot of slides at you, just showing you various public opinion data to kind of illustrate the various points. So this is data from 2018, looking at 27 countries. And the question asked to respondents here, in your opinion, should we allow more immigrants to move to our country, fewer immigrants, or about the same as we do now? And you can see very clearly here that the biggest, the largest number of respondents is in the fewer category. We also have a certain, a solid 36% who think about the same. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is the 14% who want to see more immigration. So that is always a very small proportion of the population. That's a pretty consistent pattern. And you may be interested in having a bit of a breakdown of that by country. And I think you can see my cursor here. So the first set of countries are European countries. You can see kind of Greece at the top here, at least in that year when that data was gathered, 82% of Greek respondents want to see fewer immigrants entering, as currently are. There is quite a bit of variation down to Spain, but again, the median is 51% want to see fewer immigrants. Here we've got South Asia, Southeast Asia and Australia. Want to draw your attention to Israel here. Again, Israel has a pretty consistent pattern of immigrant unfriendly attitudes in general, talking about immigrants in general. 73% of Israelis want to see fewer immigrants coming to Israel. And then here, the United States and Canada, it may surprise us given what we observe in terms of US politics and immigration, but what is quite characteristic here about the United States is the polarization. We've got about less than a third want to see less, and then 24% want to see more. That's a pretty strong segment here, want to see more immigration. So we kind of see a polarization of what the public wants, this 44% in the middle. Canada is a pretty immigrant-friendly country when it comes to public opinion in comparative perspective. So that's just generally asking about levels of immigration. Now, the second point here is that people make distinctions about what kind of immigrants they think should be allowed to enter. The first kind of dimension that people have views on is national or ethnic origin of immigrants. And there is a clear bias in favor of immigration from Western as opposed to non-Western regions. And actually, before I show you this, I should say it's actually something that's quite hard to get data on, because people are quite reluctant to often state their views openly if they express a particular ethnic preference or racial preference, right? Something that we call social desirability bias, that nobody wants to be seen as racist. And so people are careful in terms of how they voice their views on immigration. And obviously immigration very easily touches on ethnic or national origin. So there are some ways in which researchers try to get around that, but it's always an imperfect attempt to do so. So here, one kind of proxy, one shortcut of trying to get at bias based on region is, this is data from the European Union asking, do you want to see more immigrants coming from within the European Union, i.e. Western immigrants, or from outside the EU? Much of that would be associated with non-Western countries. And there is variation, but you can see that in all countries, the dark column here is the one which is from outside the EU that raises the biggest concern, right? So there's a preference for immigrants from other European countries over those who come from outside of Europe. There are some countries that are where it's pretty even, like Spain, but in general, there is a preference for European immigrants. This is data from comparing Europe and the United States, and they're asking people what characteristics are important to you when it comes to immigrants. Here we see, speaking the national language is seen as important, having a job offer important, having a high level of education, having a family member in the country. And then this is obviously the lowest, but it's still significant in terms of coming from a Christian country, not something that we would typically, speak very openly about, that immigrants should come from Christian countries. Again, we're talking here about immigrants into Europe, immigrants into the United States. So still about a third of Europeans admit that it's important to them that immigrants come from Christian countries. And in the European context, the counterpoint is immigrants from Muslim countries, right? That's what's in people's minds as they answer that question. So a clear preference of Christian over Muslim immigrants, to the extent that religion or cultural background is seen as important. And then this is Canadian data. Do you agree or disagree that Canada accepts too many immigrants from racial minority groups? And you can see and this is a quite consistent finding, a big shift in the 1990s in public opinion. So you can see until the 1990s, more people agree that Canada accepts too many immigrants from racial minority groups than those who disagree, but then that reverses. But even bearing that in mind, that at least most people don't admit that they have a preference for a racial preference in terms of immigrants, you can still see that, not that much less than a third still think there should be fewer immigrants from racial minority groups. So there is still some preference. And again, we know that that underestimates the amount of ethnic or racial preference there is, because people don't openly admit to that. The next point here is that, again, looking at what immigrants are seen as more desirable than others, high-skilled immigrants are seen as more desirable than others. And that is a very consistent finding. It's relatively easy to measure because there is not the same kind of stigma associated with that preference than talking about ethnic or racial or religious origin of immigrants. And so here we can see that the question here posed to the public is, thinking about immigration, would you support encouraging highly skilled people to immigrate and work in our country, or would you oppose encouraging them to come? And you can see that the support column is in most countries significantly stronger than in the oppose. So that's a really consistent finding. Again, Israel here is a little bit more evenly balanced. There's a minority of countries where this finding is not so strong. But again, typically there is a finding in favor of high-skilled immigration. And certainly that is very much true in Canada here, right? 84% favor high-skilled immigrants. Now, this is really interesting because this question now is asked to people who said that they actually oppose immigration. So among those who say that their country should allow fewer or no immigrants at all, this shows us the percentage of those who either oppose or support highly skilled people to immigrate. So we're talking about people who want to see less or no immigration. But then the question is, well, okay, but what about if people are high skilled? And you can see even among those immigration skeptics, there is surprisingly high support to encourage high skilled people to come. Now, again, some variation as we move down here, especially Netherlands, Israel, and Italy. But still, it is somewhat surprising that people who may be opposed to immigration many are willing to reconsider when the focus is on high skilled immigrants. The third point I'd like to make is that when we look at what the public thinks about now moving away from immigration and levels of immigration to really looking at immigrants who are already in the country and how they're integrating, the findings are pretty mixed. It's harder to come up with patterns across countries. So here the question that is asked in the survey is, immigrants today make our country stronger because of their worker talents. Do you agree with that? Or do you agree that immigrants today are a burden on our country because they take our jobs and social benefits? So, I mean, that's a stark choice, right? You either really think of them as a great economic contribution, or you think of them as a real economic problem. So people don't really have a middle answer here. But you can see here those who think that they make our country stronger. And again, what people are prompted here is to think about the economic contributions of immigration. I want to emphasize that. And so you can see in Canada, pretty strong support in favor of this notion that immigrants in the country are actually serve the national interest. There are countries down here. You can see where that is less the case. Again, Israel, only 26% think that immigrants make our country stronger, with more people disagreeing. Russia, 18% think positively, 61% negatively. Hungary, we've heard a lot about Hungary, especially during the Syrian refugee crisis, in terms of high levels of anti-immigrant sentiment in Hungary. Now here people are asked, immigrants in our country today want to adopt our customs and way of life. Do you agree with that? Or do you agree that immigrants today want to be distinct from our society? And I imagine the subscript here is to think that if people think immigrants want to be distinct from society, that's a bad thing. That generally people have a preference for immigrants to become more like the society into which they are they're settling in. You see a lot of variation here again, hard to kind of come up with a clear pattern in terms of how supportive people are. Canada here, pretty evenly split in terms of how people think about immigrants' integration into Canadian society. Let's see, Israel, 51 think immigrants want to be distinct, 36 think they adopt Israeli customs, ways of life. So it's harder to come up with a pattern. You can see here the median, these 18 countries, not that different from each other, the two different sets of answers. Now, here we're getting back to the question of religion and the distinction between Muslim immigrants and non-Muslim immigrants. Again, bearing in mind that the biggest, religious minority arriving in Europe is Muslim. And here, although we have the United States and Canada, here we can see some countries don't really make a distinction in terms of Muslim integration versus non-Muslim integration, but where there is this distinction, people think that Muslim immigrants are integrating less well. Very pronounced in Germany here, very pronounced in Spain, but even in the US and even in Canada, there is a different opinion on different views on Muslim integration compared to immigrants in general. And this is, I'd like to emphasize that Islam hasn't been politicized in the same way in Canada. And even, well, in the US, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but in Europe, Islam is extremely politicized, and a lot of immigration debates are really tinged with Islamophobia in a way that is not quite the case here. And even though with that in mind, there is a difference here in terms of how Canadians think about Muslim immigrants and their integration. And then my final point, number 4 here, is that there is variation over time, right? So sometimes we kind of see that snapshot data. We see data from 1 year, and it's really important sometimes to look at a few years in a row to get a sense of how representative is that finding about how people in general think, because things could happen in a given year that really skews or prompts people to answer differently than they generally would. Now, this is, again, going back, this is an extremely long time period. There are not many questions in public opinion surveys that have been asked for such a long period of time. So this is one of my favorite graphs because it really allows us to look at Canadian opinion from 1977 until, in this case, 2019. And here is the view, do you think that immigration levels are too high? And you can see again, until the late 90s, the majority of Canadians think that immigration levels are too high. And then we see this really stark reversal. And this is pretty consistent. We see ups and downs, right? But overall, there's a clear trend of greater support for immigration. Certainly the largest proportion of answers typically is that immigration levels are just right. That's what Canadians think in terms of the greatest proportion of answers. And then some think it's too high, some think it's too low. So again, this is really interesting, and we can think about why is it, what prompts people to change their views. Now, this is another example of how opinion can change, in this case, as a result of events. This is basically looking at 2014, before the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, and then 4 years after, right? So kind of toward the end in terms of the the arrival of large numbers of Syrians. Obviously, the refugee crisis in Syria is continuing today. But in terms of the public's awareness and the numbers that made their way into Europe, it's really this period. And you can see that the countries that were kind of bearing the brunt of arrivals, public opinion became quite a bit more negative. In Greece, we see a 9-point drop in the view that immigrants make the country stronger. Germany also quite pronounced, Italy, Poland a little bit. And then there are some countries that did not receive many immigrants from that period that actually have a positive change over time. So just the bigger point is there is some change over time. And public opinion data is notorious in typically not being, you need to really ask the same question for many years over time to be able to have these trend lines that we just saw in the Canadian case. That's really rare. And so we have to always bear that in mind when we look at figures. So this is just giving you with some patterns of public opinion to give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about when I'm now going to talk about what drives these attitudes. Yeah. And so the first set of variables, factors that shape these attitudes are demographics. And again, this should not be surprising to anyone who has done a little bit of public opinion research. Demographic factors always matter in terms of explaining why do people provide different answers, different views on questions. Age is a really important predictor of immigration attitudes. Now here, it's a European average and the United States. This is, sorry, I don't have Canada in here. And what we see here, so the dotted line here is Europe, is the United States, and then the solid line is Europe. What we see that, I mean, there is this strange point here with a 35 to 44 cohort, but in general, we see kind of an increase in terms of people who think immigration is more of a problem. So as people get older, and we see this in many different, measures of conservatism, that people become more conservative with age. The same is true for immigration as kind of a social issue that fits into that conservative liberal dimension. And so typically younger people are more supportive of immigration than older people. That's a pretty consistent finding. So we can predict somebody's attitudes in part by just looking at their age. Obviously that's an average, that's not true for everybody, but it is a pattern that holds. Then we can look at somebody's partisanship. What party do they support? Are they to the left? Are they to the right? And that already can predict some of their attitudes as well. Here, again, it's a percentage who say that immigrants today make our country stronger because of their work and talent. So those who are in favor of immigration, again, being prompted to think of immigration as an economic good. And you see people on the right, people in the center, and people on the left. And here, just to kind of talk you through this, for the United States, we see that 37% of those presumably here who identify as Republican think that immigrants make the United States stronger. Compare that to 83% of those who are Democratic voters who identify as Democrat, right? That is, and this is kind of, see this difference here between the right and the left, that is particularly far apart in the United States and points to the polarization in US politics, where people based on their partisanship really have quite different views on immigration. Let me just, Israel, you can see Israel here. And then Canada, you can see how far Canada is toward the supportive, immigrant supportive end of the dimension here. And you also see that polarization is relatively weak in Canada compared to some other countries. So 65% of right-leaning respondents think that immigrants make our country stronger. That's a majority, even of those who identify to be on the political right. And then that goes up to 81%, those who are on the left politically. Probably the most restrictive country here would be Greece, where even those on the political left, only 19% of those think immigrants make Greece stronger. So partisanship is another demographic variable that matters, that shapes how people think about immigration. Here's another example of how partisanship matters. That's for the United States. And here we're looking at refugees. And this is the percentage of those who say that the United States either has a responsibility or does not have a responsibility in accepting refugees. Again, this is in the aftermath of Syria. You can see here 2017, 18. And you can see those who lean Republican, right, 62%, 68%, depending on what year, think that the United States does not have responsibility accepting refugees. When you look at Democrats, we've got 71%, 74% who think the United States has a responsibility accepting refugees. So this is a pretty stark difference, again, in line with polarization that we've been seeing in US politics. And then my last example here of partisanship is, again, looking at Muslims, anti-Muslim views. Again, these are European countries, and all we need to kind of look at here is the difference between right and left, which gives you a sense of how far apart are people on the left from those on the right when it comes to views toward Muslims. So this is the percentage who hold unfavorable view of Muslims in their country. You can see Germany is particularly pronounced here. If you're on the left, only 20% hold unfavorable views. Those on the right, 47%. That's a big difference. And it gets smaller, but it holds true for all these cases. Now I'm going to talk quite a bit about education tonight, and this is my first slide on education, because education is one of the most powerful predictors of immigration attitudes. And here, again, this is this question of, saying that immigration is more of a problem. And here we're looking at different levels of education. So here, elementary school or less, some high school, graduation from high school, having gone to college, and then postgraduate education. And this, setting this aside here, we can see that the percentage of those who think that immigration is a problem goes down quite significantly as people become more educated, right? It's true both in the United States and in Europe. And this is a big difference. If you look at here, majorities saying immigration is more of a problem, and then you get to a postgraduate degree, it's less than a third. So education makes a big difference in terms of how people think about immigration. And I will return to this later because this is a really interesting pattern. And so I'll just give you the puzzle here is that we know, and all studies show that educational attainment is negatively related to opposition to immigration, which means the more educated you are, the less opposed you will be to immigration. But the big question is, why is that? And that gets me into, so we're moving away now from demographics to kind of more really interesting discussions in research in terms of, is it economics or culture? Aside from these demographic factors, is it economics or culture that really shapes how people think about immigration, that influences whether people think of immigrants as a threat or as a benefit to society? And so let me start out with economics, because this is something that we hear about a lot just in the media. And we come across common sense explanations that typically say something like, people oppose immigration because of labor market competition. People are scared to lose their jobs. If there's too much immigration, they may be concerned about wage dumping, that immigrants will reduce wages over time. So the sense that people are just looking out for themselves, which is kind of a natural instinct, and therefore think of immigrants as an economic threat to their own well-being. Now, if that is true, right, if kind of rationally, we can infer that if that's true, individuals should oppose immigration of workers who have similar skills, because that's the competition, right? These are the kind of people who will apply for the same kind of jobs that you may want to apply for. So any competition argument, one way of getting it, that is looking at, okay, what is the skill level? Where does the competition come from in terms of immigrants entering the labor market? And then once we look at that, we find something really interesting. We find, first of all, that workers across industries who have very similar views on immigration, they do so even though they have different skill profiles and they work in sectors that have different immigrant workforces. So people who work in a sector where there are lots of immigrants, where you would imagine there to be, tough labor market competition, they don't think any differently about immigration from workers in a sector that does not have strong component of immigrants, like all controlling for everything else. That is actually not a pattern that we see. Another pattern is that workers at all skill levels express more support for high-skilled immigration. Again, we would expect, if that economic self-interest argument is right, we'd expect for high-skilled workers to be more threatened by high-skilled immigrants in terms of labor market competition, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And higher educated people are more likely to support immigration regardless of skill level. Again, that impact of education that I already mentioned. So there is a lot of support for high-skilled immigration, even among high-skilled native-born workers. And then really interesting, and this is another really consistent finding that goes counter to kind of common sense explanations that we often read about in the media, is that being unemployed has no impact on immigration attitudes. Yeah, you'd think people losing their jobs, that's when they feel the most vulnerable, when they're really concerned about immigrants possibly competing for their jobs. But you ask somebody before they're unemployed, when they're unemployed after, in terms of their immigration attitudes, they will give you the same answer. That experience of unemployment doesn't seem to have any impact in how people think about immigration. And so based on these findings, we can conclude that it's not really economic self-interest that is the key driver in how people think about immigrants. Yeah, we find that immigration attitudes have very little evidence. There's very little evidence that shows that they are correlated with personal economic circumstances, such as unemployment or employment, but also even income, drops in income, increases in income. It doesn't make a difference in how people think about immigration. So we can say that individual self-interest explanation that looks at labor market competition doesn't seem to be holding up to empirical scrutiny. Now, this is not to say that economics doesn't matter. And now we're moving from self-interest explanations that looks at people's personal circumstances and how well they do, to what is called sociotropic concerns. And sociotropic simply means group-based. And here we're looking at the country as a whole, the economy as a whole, rather than people's individual economic circumstance or the circumstance of their household. It doesn't even have to be just the individual, the household. And there we do see that during economic downturns, there is less support for immigration. So people kind of look at, GDP, unemployment rates at a macro level and factor that into how they think about immigration. And so in terms of thinking about the impact of economics and how people think about immigration, we can conclude that these sociotropic assessments, these macro level assessments of national economic performance do have an impact, but not the personal economic circumstance. So that's the kind of set of findings that the literature comes up with when we look at economics. Now, let's go back to that question of education. And I said earlier that it's a really interesting puzzle. Why is it that education is the most important predictor of how people think about immigration? And again, right, there are many different factors that shape how people think about immigration, but education is the most powerful one, the most reliable predictor how somebody will respond on a public opinion survey on immigration. And if we bear that in mind, that education is so important, then we realize that these, macro level concerns about the economy, they don't help us to understand why education is so important. because people's level of education is not correlated to the state of the economy, right? If people express more hostility, their level of education doesn't change. So there's something else going on that cannot be captured by just looking at macroeconomics and the state of the economy. That factors in, but it only explains a relatively small part of the public's attitudes toward immigration. And when we look at public opinion research more generally, you find education is a powerful predictor of many sets of attitudes. And in general, when we look at anything diversity related, or on social issues, that education is a very powerful predictor. So tolerance of diversity more generally is something that education promotes. And obviously, when we talk about diversity, immigration diversity are very closely connected to each other. So then researchers say, okay, well, economics only gets us this far in understanding immigration attitudes. Let's look at culture as an alternative explanation. And here the explanation would be that anti-immigration attitudes, they originate not so much in the sense of economic threat, but in cultural values that relate to national identity. And we know that those are very much shaped by education, tolerance and kind of an acceptance of diversity. And so I'm going to present you with some studies that really have tried to tease out the role that cultural values play in how people think about immigration. This is a study that was conducted in Switzerland. You may think a very insignificant country, but it's a fascinating country for researchers, in part because until not that long ago, there are certain cantons, certain provinces, and also municipalities in Switzerland that use a popular referendum to make decisions on naturalization. So these are immigrants who have fulfilled all the requirements to become Swiss citizens that are set at the federal level. But now in Switzerland, we've got this tripartite system of citizenship where the federal level has to agree, the provincial level, and the municipal level. It's a very interesting regime. And in some of these municipalities, people held, there were referendums about naturalization of individual applicants. So the people, the kind of system of direct democracy, the people decided whether somebody who met all the requirements to become a Swiss citizen in terms of residence requirement, speaking the language, all the things that we may also be familiar with in the Canadian context, people who met that threshold, whether they would be deemed suitable to be Swiss citizens. And so what happened in these municipalities, that voters get a ballot and a description of the applicants in the mail. And the kind of information about these immigrants who want to become Swiss citizens include what you can see here on the right of the slide. When they arrived, so how long they've lived in Switzerland. Again, bearing in mind, they're all meeting the residence requirements. Some sociodemographics in terms of their gender, their age. I think this must be, there are photographs of these headshots of these immigrants, and the researchers here, I don't know how they went about this, but they kind of looked at attractive versus not attractive. Immigration history, have they applied before? Were they born in Switzerland? Again, Switzerland doesn't have birthright citizenship, so you can be born a foreigner in Switzerland. Were they refugees? And then economic credentials in terms of education, skill level. Have they been unemployed in the past? They're not unemployed right now because otherwise they wouldn't qualify to naturalize. Language skills. How strong is their command of the Swiss language? In this case, they're all in German-speaking Switzerland, so it would be a command of German. Integration status, and these are the words that are actually used on these assessments that are sent by the immigration authorities to voters, whether they're assimilated, integrated, adjusted, or indistinguishable from Swiss citizens. So a value in terms of how similar are they in their customs and way of life to Swiss citizens. And then we also have the country of origin here, Southern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, Turkey, Asian countries, other non-European countries. And so what these researchers did, they conducted what is called a natural experiment. And a natural experiment is something where researchers don't have to manipulate anything. There's just something that's happening anyway. And all they do is observe and analyze what is happening. And so they're looking at, they're looking at these, they're looking at variation in naturalization rates across different municipalities and different applicants. Why do some applicants get voted in favor of and others not? What distinguishes them? And because so this is already happening. So the researchers are observing actual behaviors, and they access all these voting ballots through archives. So they're observing actual behaviors, and they're observing behavior that is done unobserved. It's a secret ballot, a closed ballot. And so this whole concern about social desirability, where people will say something differently or act differently because in this case, they wouldn't want to be seen as prejudiced in any way, that is really minimized in a way that typically when you ask survey questions, you cannot minimize. Yeah, so it measures actual behavior of what these Swiss citizens did, and they did so unobserved, right? So a lack of self-consciousness about their decision whether or not to accept somebody, to vote in favor or against an applicant for Swiss citizenship. Now, the first thing to say here before I talk more about the findings is that it's very common to be not accepted as Swiss citizens, 37% rejection rate. Again, emphasizing these are people who meet all the criteria that the federal state sets. And this is just basically people's view. Should those people be Swiss or not? It's really a very subjective judgment. And the risk of not being naturalized, of not being accepted, is relatively high with 37%. It's not trivial. And now what the researchers do here, sorry, I've messed up the text. So we are comparing these different regions, and they find that the no votes were 13 to 15 percentage points higher for applicants who originated from the former Yugoslavia and Turkey. And let me just see what so this is 13 to 15 percentage points higher than applicants from Northwestern Europe. So a heavy penalty, really heavy penalty for people coming from less Western context. Again, both of these countries have a large population of Muslim immigrants. Parts of Yugoslavia are Muslim, others not. Turkey's very, predominantly Muslim. When we look at Central and Eastern European countries, and this is where my slide is messed up, we see a 6% penalty coming from these countries compared to Northwestern Europe. So there's a clear preference for applicants from Northwestern Europe, 6% penalty for those from Central and Eastern Europe, and then 13 to 15% penalty for those coming from Yugoslavia and Turkey. Yeah, so this is something that, again, it's able to measure that because people are able to vote unobserved. They're not concerned about being seen as racist by expressing expressing a preference for one national origin as opposed to another. And when we look at all the different factors that explain differences in acceptance rates, this is the most important one. 40% of all the variation within towns, right? Why do some get accepted and others rejected? It's all due to country of origin. Really important factor here. So that's kind of, again, just a reminder, we're talking about the importance of culture, or the assumption that culture might really matter in how people think about immigrants or immigration. So here, ethnic origin, national origin, really is a very strong influence on how people assess the suitability of applicants for Swiss citizenship. And just to show you the comparison to economic factors, they also matter, but much, much less. So when we look at skill, education, employment, they're statistically significant, but it's small. High educational attainment gets somebody a boost of 1.2 percentage points. That's really small. Again, compared to low education. So there is a preference, but it's a much weaker preference than the country of origin preference. And then if somebody had a period of unemployment in the past, 6% point penalty, that's significant. But again, it doesn't compare to, right, the earlier 13 to 15 percentage point penalty for those originating from Yugoslavia and Turkey. So this is it's a really influential study that really points to the fact that yes, economics matters some, but culture is more powerful in how it shapes how people think about immigration, in this case here, membership, citizenship. So the case for culture is one where the argument is that opposition to immigration doesn't stem from self-interested concerns about wages or employment, but from differences in cultural values, and believes that immigration has impacts on, country as a whole, a little bit of economic, but also tied to national identity, cultural impact of immigration. And here I just want to briefly talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that has been used to explain why this is happening, and that's coming out of social psychology from social identity theory by Hirschfeld and Turner. I actually think that should be 1968 if I'm not mistaken. So the theory here is that social identity is fundamentally derived from membership in a relevant social group, who we think of ourselves as being a member of. That can be based on gender, on national origin, on religion, on class, right? All of us are members in some ways of several different groups, but that's all part of our social identity. And we make distinctions in terms of people who are within these groups and who are outside of these groups. Now, Hirschfeld and Turner argued that we all have a need, kind of an innate need to enhance our self-image, to feel good about ourselves. And so to the extent that we see ourselves as members of a particular social group, in order to feel good about ourselves, we increase the status of that, what they call the in-group, right? This is a positive group who we're a member of. And again, this is happening at a subconscious level often. We may not even be aware of that. That's a pretty natural process. Now, of course, when immigration happens, right, that introduces a lot of difference. It introduces, depending on where it is from, but it often introduces cultural difference, ethnic difference, religious difference between host society, which now we can think of as an in-group in relation to immigration, and the newcomers, who are in this case the out-group. And because of the need to affirm our social identity and the group we are part of, in this case, Canadians, citizens will negatively stereotype those who are not part of that group, the out group. And social identity theorists will say that the greater we perceive, and again, the perception is really all that matters, right? We can argue, is there really a cultural difference? It's all the perception that matters. The greater that perceived cultural difference, the greater the hostility will be. So that's a basic kind of dynamic that comes out of social identity theory that's been used to explain the importance of culture in how people think about immigration and immigrants. And if you could just bear with me to show you one more experiment, again, focused on a small country, in this case, the Netherlands. This is a survey experiment. And a survey experiment, it's not a natural experiment where things are happening and you just observe it, but it's a public opinion survey that gets manipulated, where people, different groups, randomly get different options that they can choose. And I'll show you in a second here. So the idea is to really tease out the relative importance of economic threat versus cultural threat, to explain why people hold anti-immigration attitudes. And so the survey manipulates the salience, how prominent those threats are, by distinguishing between economic threats to national and threats to national identity. So this is what these are the words of the survey. A group, so this is what the respondent reads: a group of immigrants that may come here is characterized by, and then different respondents get different options. One set of respondents gets, these immigrants are highly educated and well suited for well-paying jobs. Another set of respondents gets, they're not highly educated or well-trained, only suited for unskilled job. A third set of respondents gets the option of speaking Dutch fluently and have a very good chance to fit in smoothly with the Dutch culture. And then the fourth group don't speak Dutch fluently and don't have a good chance to fit in smoothly with the Dutch culture. And then they are all asked, do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea for these immigrants to be allowed to come here? Right, so they only see one of these and have to kind of give their view in terms of how desirable are these immigrants. And again, you can see how the researchers are trying to kind of distinguish between economic factors and cultural factors. And this is, these are the findings. It's called the fitting in experiment. So this is fitting in well culturally, doesn't fit in well culturally, fits in well economically, does not fit in well economically. And I'm going to just look at the two bottom bars here. So this is a very good idea for those people to come. This is a good idea. So these are the supporters of those immigrants to arrive in the Netherlands. Those who fit in well culturally, you can see here, whatever, 65% or so of respondents think that those immigrants, it's a good idea for these immigrants to come, right? So cultural fit here, a lot of support once that's in place, compared to lack of cultural fit. These are the two bars here. And so that's about 25%. So look, going from up here to down here, that's an enormous drop that shows how important cultural fit is in the mind of those who completed that survey. Now, with economics, there is a similar pattern, but it's far less pronounced. Those who fit in well economically, about half of respondents think it's a good idea for them to come to the Netherlands. And then those who don't fit in well economically, well, that's maybe 35%, right? But you can see even here for those who don't fit in well economically, there's more support for them, their immigration, than for those who don't fit in well culturally. So again, both matters, but culture, if you have to choose one or the other, culture trumps economics. Culture is a greater determinant of how people think about immigration than economics. That's the conclusion that we can draw from these studies. And then a final thing about this particular studies is the question of, is this a mobilizing effect or a galvanizing effect? And what that means is, the galvanizing effect means, does cultural difference trigger these anti-immigration attitudes because it activates those who are already predisposed to respond negatively to immigrants, right? So these are people who already hold anti-immigration attitudes. They get asked this question and it triggers that already existing anti-immigration attitude. It's called a galvanizing effect. A mobilizing effect is those people who don't hold these attitudes, but now get asked that question. And so they get mobilized to think along these terms, and how do they respond? And it shows that in the study that both is at play. And that's a really important finding that shows that anti-immigration attitudes can be triggered even by people through, you know, let's say political messaging, and we're going to talk about parties in a second, even for people for whom those attitudes may not be very salient, who may not hold them very strongly. Everybody, the kind of, you know, the middle, the center is vulnerable to be mobilized against immigration. That's a takeaway from that study. It's not just the fringes who are already anti-immigrant who then express that preference, right? It's the broad middle that is also affected by that. So the readiness to respond to this perception that immigrants may be a cultural threat that extends through society. All right, I think I'll have to move on a little bit faster. So I want to talk a bit about anti-immigrant parties, because I know I promised I would do that. And kind of what do we know about why have they been so successful, in particular in Europe, but we can also think about the United States in terms of the Tea Party and now the way that Republicans have really moved to the right on many issues, but also immigration. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. It just shows you the percentage of seats in the last election here that were held by anti-immigrant or far-right parties. It's significant across Europe. I'm going to go through these slides very fast because I just want to point this out, that there are sets of factors that are well established, and I think they're well known that they influence they can account for why have these parties been so successful. First of all, the increase in economic inequality and kind of stagnating income. You can see here, right, the top 1%, how income has increased since 1980. It has about doubled for the high income, the top 20%. But then you look at the middle and low income, right? And we kind of see the stagnation of income. So we've got stagnation of income for many and rising economic inequality. We also have ethnic diversity, right? Societies that 30 years ago were relatively homogeneous ethnically are becoming very diverse. And again, what we know about cultural threat and how in-groups respond to perceived difference, the out-groups who are ethnically different, that generates support for parties that react against diversity. A third set of factors is the securitization of immigration, especially in the aftermath, but even somewhat before of 9/11 in terms of the association with Muslims and terrorism, how that has also been used, instrumentalized by these parties to gain support and votes. And then I want to just spend a few minutes before I stop and let you ask questions on partisan de-alignment. That's a nice political science term. It's my home discipline after all. And de-alignment is an electoral period during which voters established attachments to political parties weaken and mass party coalitions dissolve. So basically voter loyalties, that voters have held loyalties for a long time to, families vote in a certain way, individuals vote in a certain way. When this all changes, when something shifts in a big way, when these patterns break down, this is a period of partisan de-alignment. And this is something that we have been seeing. And that's a really important factor for why we see the success of these far-right parties. And what you've been seeing since the 1980s, that left of center mainstream parties, typically they're called social democrats of some kind, their support has eroded in large part because the industrial sector has shrunk so much and unions have become weakened, right? So traditionally, kind of the working class union members would vote center left. That has broken down in a way that was not the case 20 years ago. On the center right, and this is particularly true for Europe, societies have become so secularized that the traditional, kind of loyalty of Christian voters in favor of Christian Democrats, which are typically European center-right parties, has broken down. So again, the center-right in these European countries can no longer rely on religious voters to support them. So you see both center-left and center-right mainstream parties no longer have that support that they had been able to count on throughout the post-war period. And even when voters still vote along those lines that their parents did, we see that their support is less intense, less principled, more conditional. They may, switch their votes much more often than their parents ever would have done. Here you can see these are just patterns in party identification. We've got the UK, we've got Germany, we've got the United States, we've got France, the same pattern where you see declining party identification between, this is 1955 and then 2015. Just some images a graph to just make the same point I just made. Now, part of an important intervention here is the rise of non-economic issues. And I've mentioned a few here, right? Before it was kind of economics that mattered. Are you voting left or right? It depends on class. Now there are all these issues that actually have nothing to do with the economy directly. that matter to people in terms of how they vote. And here you can just see the issues that are on party programs, comparing from 1950 to 2010. And you can see economic issues were always most important until the early 80s. And now they're clearly a minority of issues that are in party programs, right? Non-economic issues, which include immigration, have become much more prominent in how parties appeal to voters than economic issues. And so the consequences of this is that on the one hand, we've got this declining voter identification with the established parties, with the center left and the center right. Then we've got the rise of identity politics, these non-economic issues in terms of immigration and other social issues. And that put that together, there's an opening for these new far-right parties that cut across that old left-right divide, because they can draw in voters from both the left and the right, and they mobilize new voters who don't have a partisan identity yet through, in this case, anti-immigration agendas. And I will just tell you very briefly that the kind of looking at what have mainstream parties done to deal with that, because it's a huge electoral threat. Some have tried to accommodate, which means they try to integrate anti-immigration issues into their own agenda to get those voters back. Hasn't been particularly successful in terms of gaining votes, but it has been effective in moving policy agendas to an anti-immigration agenda. You can see this across many European countries. Again, Canada really, we kind of have to forget that we're in Canada right here in terms of what I'm talking about, because Canada has been one of the very few exceptions to that. Some parties have kind of been adversarial in their strategy and countered those anti-immigration positions. Again, hasn't been very effective. A third strategy has been to kind of dismiss it and to kind of ignore the issue. Again, has not been very effective. So neither ignoring these populists on the far right, nor trying to co-opt their agenda has been successful as kind of a reestablishment of these centrist parties' electoral support. And so I will just ask, I'll just have one more slide here and then I will really stop. And that is a big one discussion that is happening right now, is because it's a question of what's the way forward here? It's really hard to figure that out. In some European countries, and in particular in Germany, people, well, there is sense that Green parties may be able. So Green parties as, again, one of these newer parties on the left, as opposed to the far right, as these parties who started out running on environmental issues now take on more issues and move a bit more to the center and appeal to larger electorate, they may become, maybe the Green parties are the parties of the future in terms of a counterweight to far right parties. Again, Germany, I think there's a lot of, I think some optimism that that could be the case, but that is also not true in all countries. So I'm just going to put that out there. And I think I'm going to stop the share. Larry, is it okay for the Q&A so we can actually see each other?
Yes, of course. I'm going to turn it over to David now. David, are you there?
Yes, I am. So I do have a question. It's reported that the far right party in Hungary is supporting an acceptance of Ukrainian refugees. This appears to be contrary to their anti-immigrant position prior to the Russian invasion. Is this an anomaly or a watershed event? Is the
question. That's a great question. Great question. I would consider that an anomaly in that I think that it is more influenced by geopolitical considerations than a real embrace of refugees. You see the same in Poland, right? Poland has been very reluctant to accept. I mean, when you look at the Syrian refugee crisis, it's been the Eastern European countries that have really prevented a collective response to accepting Syrian refugees and distributing across European countries. Again, Poland has been very welcoming of Ukrainian refugees. Again, I think it's the common enemy And also, yeah, and I mean, we could also look at kind of cultural arguments in terms of the lack of cultural distance, right? Comparing to perception of Syrian refugees, which was the last flow into Europe, where Ukrainians are seen. I mean, there are also so many Ukrainians living in many Eastern European countries outside of Ukraine that this is seen as less of a cultural threat. But I don't think, first of all, I think it's a special group because of the geopolitics of it. But I also would be skeptical how long the support will be maintained. I think if that becomes a protracted refugee situations, when we're talking about, months, years, I'm not sure how long that support, those open arms will be open. And even these governments, I think we've seen a lot of support by the population. I think a lot depends also on are governments willing to step up and support that.
Barry Grow, do you want to unmute yourself and proceed with a question?
Yes, please. I work with some organizations that provide support to refugees and refugee claimants when they first arrive here in Vancouver. And we may be seeing some surges in the near future, either from Afghanistan. Trudeau has talked about 40,000 people coming in, but only about 5,000 have, or perhaps from Ukraine. Is there any data about public attitudes when there's a surge, a sort of sudden, compact surge of refugees arriving?
Yeah, so there is a big distinction, and this is, I think the Canadian context is really interesting because it's been one of these countries that have had a lot of support. When we think back also of 2015, 16, it was even Trudeau campaigned in favor of accepting more Syrian refugees. Actually tried to do the same in relation to Afghan refugees, where he did not score as many electoral points as he did in terms of Syrian refugees with the previous election. But what both of these groups have in common is that they're resettlement refugees, which means they're selected abroad. The Canadian government knows exactly who is coming and when they're coming, and everything is already set up in a way to welcome them, to provide housing, to have organizations like the one that you're supporting support these refugees. And so public attitudes toward resettled refugees are much more favorable than those toward asylum seekers, right? And we just have to think in terms of those trying to cross Roxham Road in Quebec or Ontario when asylum seekers came from the US into Canada, very quick backlash, or here in British Columbia, when we think about boats of Tamils arriving, right, in the 90s, very quick backlash to the arrival of 492 boat migrants. And again, the difference is that these are not selected, these are not recruited, so to speak, by the government. They just arrive. And if you look at Europe, that is the norm, right? It's not a refugee resettlement that brings all these refugees into Europe. It is these spontaneous flows. And I think that sense of threat and things being out of control that parties can really capitalize from, that's just the way that humanitarian migration works in Europe because of the way Europe is located. Canada has this very rare, I don't know whether we should call it luck, but Canada is so geographically insulated from all these pressures, right? The only country really is the United States where refugees could directly arrive without being invited to arrive. So in some ways, it's a very unusual set of circumstances, I think, that explain why Canadians have been very, in terms of public opinion, very supportive of resettling, of refugee arrivals.
Following up
Thank you.
on that, sorry. Thank you. Following up on that is a question: did Canadian attitudes to immigration becoming more favorable possibly occur because a larger percentage of the Canadian population were by then immigrants themselves?
Mm-hmm. So that certainly has something to do with it. there is a lot of evidence that suggests that support for multiculturalism, in particular in Canada, has something to do with that. The fact that we've got high levels of immigration. We have very easy access to naturalization compared to many other countries, right? 3 years of residence, not particularly arduous to become a Canadian citizen, which means people vote, right? They vote very fast after having moved here. And you also combine it with the electoral system where immigrants in urban ridings, so lots of urban ridings, really, if you cannot alienate the immigrant vote as running in that riding. So there's been a lot of support there. You cannot take an anti-immigrant position. Now, having said that, we also know that just because somebody's an immigrant doesn't mean they're going to be supportive of more immigration. They will be supportive of immigrant rights for those already in the country. But those who are arriving, sometimes immigrants are actually particularly concerned about queue jumpers. We've seen this in public opinion polls. If immigrants feel they have played by the rules and then they encounter groups that are portrayed as queue jumpers, there will be quite a negative reaction to that. So I just want to put that in there. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that immigrants become citizens fast and vote. Canada has the highest naturalization percentage anywhere in the world, which I think is a tremendous achievement. And people have a very high, participation in election compared to immigrants from other countries.
Another question. It's interesting that Israel has very low acceptance of increased immigration. That corresponds well to its treatment of non-Jewish refugees, but not to its treatment of Jewish immigrants. I wonder whether the question was phrased to distinguish between Jewish and non-Jewish immigrants.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I think that's a really relevant thing to look at. Yeah, I don't know.
And somebody's asked, doesn't the Sierra Club have an anti-immigrant history?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly groups on the would be associated with the left in terms of a progressive environmental agenda who are against immigration because they want to see a decrease in population for environmental reasons. I think that's a pretty small percentage in terms of voters who are driven by that, but it's something really interesting because it flies in the face of what I've talked about and what we typically assume in terms of the left-right divide.
Many countries have a low birth rate. So they're going to have a problem of filling jobs, and they're going to have a problem of fulfilling pension requirements. Is this correct? And the assumption that those two things are happening? And is there an effort to educate people why immigrants might be valuable in the future?
So absolutely, yes, that's correct. I think Canada is one of the countries most open about, or most fervent about educating people in terms of, you see demographic arguments for immigration very frequently in public debate. Having said that, if you really wanted to reverse the population decline, levels of admissions would have to be a lot higher than they currently are. It's a pretty small impact that immigration has on kind of lessening the demographic deficit. Although Canada, we have seen a significant increase in numbers over the past 2-3 years even. So Canada is coming closer to that, but even the Canadian intake is not enough to reverse that.
And is there education also on immigration having a positive economic impact on Canada and other countries, as opposed to, I don't want him living in my neighborhood?
So, this is a really interesting question because you hear this argument a lot in the Canadian context, and now especially in the kind of post-COVID, I'm putting quotation marks because when are we ever going to be post-COVID, but the kind of post-COVID recovery, the case for immigration, the government's making this really strong case for immigration to kind of, because of tight labor markets and a need for economic growth and recovery. When you talk to economists, and I am not an economist, but when you talk about economists and who look at the impact of immigration, they actually say that the evidence is not really there, that immigration neither harms nor significantly benefits the economy, that the economic case for immigration is much overblown in public discourse. And you know, I mean, IRCC, Immigration, Refugees, Citizens of Canada, knows that. They have their own in-house expertise, but I think it's a politically smart move to emphasize the economic benefits, which is something that, remember when we saw these graphs where where public opinion kind of changed, where all of a sudden more people are in favor of immigrants than before, that coincided really with that economic messaging of high-skilled immigration. And I think it has served Canada really well. I think one can make a strong case for immigration on other grounds. The economic case is not as strong as we would like to believe.
So we solve the workforce problems by short-term foreign workers, bring them in for the summer and send them back with no path to citizenship?
I think the question is, what are we willing to pay in terms of wages, right? The temporary foreign workers are just a fix for maintaining low-skilled, low-pay work sectors in precarious work conditions. And I think that is something that's really interesting now, looking at debates, and a lot of NGOs are really pushing for a path to permanent residence for temporary foreign workers, because they have become such an important part of the Canadian workforce and work under precarious conditions. Many have to return every year before they can re-enter. So I think there's something really interesting now to look for. Are we going to see some change? And we've seen, for example, in Quebec, you know, asylum seekers whose decision was still pending, who worked in care homes, worked in hospitals, have been allowed to become a small number permanent residents in recognition of it's called the Guardian Angel scheme, their contributions as essential workers. And there is hope among pro-immigrant organizations that a new appreciation of essential workers, and right, most essential workers are not the kind of high-skilled workers that Canada likes to recruit. It's in different sectors that recognition may open up a path to permanent residence for some that are on temporary permits.
Does anybody else have some question? Oh, here we go. What attitudes are you seeing toward immigration amongst your students?
So I teach a course, all the courses actually I teach are on immigration. So one question is, to what extent do these courses attract students who are already, you know, committed to immigration as something that they value? And so most of my students, I mean, they all have their own story, right? Their families arrived, or they themselves arrived, and there's overwhelming support for immigration among my students. Again, I cannot tell you how representative that is for UBC in general in terms of the undergraduates. Certainly what we've seen in terms of the demographic patterns, right, that people in their 20s will be much more supportive of immigration than people my age, suggest it's more widespread, but maybe I'm getting the most supportive students in my classes.
Would anybody else like to unmute themselves and ask a question?
Antje, it's Larry Bloom again. As a follow-up question to my question on the Hungarian far-right party, the situation with refugees from Ukraine seems not only tragic, horrific, but very unique to me in the sense that two things. One, are they refugees or are they immigrants to these countries they're going to? Do you know if they're waiving the usual protocol and they're being made citizens of these countries? What's happening there? The other question I have is what seems very unique is they're almost all women, and particularly women with children, because the husbands, fathers, have stayed behind. And so what unique, how are they going to fend for themselves? Where is this going? It just seems so unique and so tragic. What's your feeling on those 2 points?
so the way that people are being admitted into these countries, so these are all EU countries, right, that the Ukrainian refugees are entering into. And the European Union has visa-free travel, an association agreement with the Ukraine that allows for visa-free entry. So they can't necessarily come and work, but they can come and spend some time in the country. So in that sense, the borders are very open. People have to show ID documents, but from what I've read, even that requirement for biometric identification is being waived, given the urgency of accepting people, of giving people access to safety. So that's pretty uncomplicated. And that's only different from, again, looking at Syrians, right, who did not have visa-free entry into these countries. It's my sense that, I mean, there's such a large Ukrainian diaspora, especially in Poland, but also some other European countries, that many have relatives or friends who they're trying to reach to support them. But I think the bulk of the work will fall to NGOs, right? And I think, I mean, I would expect the International Red Cross to get involved here as well. UNHCR, I have to see what the UN Refugee Agency, in terms of what supports they're going to provide. It seems that even, like, I know in the case of Poland that the government provided support in terms of they're now telling people they can only stay in accommodation for 2 nights, right? And as you're saying, we're talking about lots of women with lots of small kids. What that means, what do you do after 2 nights? It's still pretty cold, right? We're not in the summer. So I think a lot of that will fall to civil society in terms of people volunteering in organizations, until there is a more coordinated response. I know that, I mean, I think what I could also imagine is that I know Germany, which is a case I know particularly well because that's where I'm originally from, has opened up a lot of reception centers and is anticipating Ukrainian refugees. So to what extent governments like the German government will actually coordinate bringing people into Germany to them, because there are infrastructures in place. I haven't seen that yet, but could imagine that will happen.
Thank you.
David? David?
Yeah. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor Ellermann. Very, very stimulating, interesting presentation. When you spoke about partisan de-alignment, this is something that I've been reflecting on, although I didn't put it in those terms for some time. Back when I studied political science in the late 60s, I remember all the studies at the time showed that the way you voted depended on how your parents voted or how your grandparents voted. Well, obviously that's changed dramatically over these many, many years. Some people watching this may know I had a very large involvement with the non-existent Progressive Conservative Party. And this is a bit off topic, and maybe it's a topic for another conversation, but when you talk about partisan de-alignment, made me think about the current state of the Conservative Party in Canada, a party that I've always had trouble supporting, and more so now that it seems to be going in the direction of turning to a populist perspective. Not a populist perspective that seems to touch on immigration, at least for the moment, could someday, I suppose. To me, it's a matter of concern because it eliminates any alternative to the current government moving forward. Anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on that. It's not directly related to your topic tonight, but I just wanted to point out this partisan de-alignment thing really hit a chord with me. I also wanted to say that when I got involved in politics way back when, it was with the Progressive Conservative Party. And I remember my grandmother who came to Canada when Sir Wilfrid Laurier was Prime Minister. And when she heard I was getting involved with the Conservatives, she gave me you know what, because Wilfrid Laurier was a good liberal and you shouldn't turn your back on what happened in 1908 or whenever it was. Anyway, those are the days. But thank you for this very much.
Thank you, Jerry. Just to say, you know, the big, we see a huge expansion in immigration in the 1980s, which was done under the Progressive Conservative government of Mulroney. And I think the Canadian Progressive or Conservatives have been quite unique in being very pro-immigration in a way that most center-right parties in other countries have not been. I mean, now the question is, yeah, how is the Conservative Party changing? And we certainly saw in 2016, right, some attempt under Harper to use a cultural wedge issue in terms of the kind of, you may recall, the barbarian cultural hotline, like some anti-Muslim agendas that, not attacking multiculturalism, I think that's too much of an electoral liability, but targeting particular groups of immigrants. But interestingly enough, it was not successful. That's something that I think is really, I'm still puzzling about. It's really interesting. Thank you for your observations.
Larry, I think I'll turn it back to you unless somebody, one more question from anybody?
I see Lucy.
Okay, Lucy, unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
You're muted
Lucy,
still.
unmute yourself. Lucy.
Yeah, I did, right?
Okay.
Thank you, Bill. So I wanted to go back to many of the people that are here tonight are children or grandchildren of refugees that did make it out of Europe some way, shape, or form. And I noticed that it wasn't mentioned anything about Canada's old immigration problem, which was none is too many. And I wonder whether Andrew has anything to say today if Israelis can come here more easily, if Jews can come here more easily, or is it just a forgotten stage of our times?
They are, I mean, I think, you know, I think Israel is among the countries, but I would have to double check that. There's a number of Western countries, which I think includes Israel, that have favorable immigration conditions into Canada in terms of, for example, working holiday visas, where young people under the age of 30 can come for a year and work here. You go up to Cyprus skiing and all the people, right? That's the kind of, that's where the folks come from. I think Israel is included into that, but I would have to double check that. So there is, I certainly, I don't see any evidence that the anti-Semitic policies of the period that you're talking about, that is, at least it's not part of, certainly not part of the legal context in terms of.
I just wanted to remind everybody about it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yes, yeah. And I think that is, you know, that big change you see in Canada. I mean, even well after World War II, right? The limited support for immigration in general, things have changed a lot, right? And sometimes we forget, yeah, where we come from.
Like I see 4 people in my little thing that are that came, you know, during that time or a long time after, or their parents did, or something like that. And the reason, well, we know what happened. Everybody died, were murdered. Anyway.
Yes.
Maybe I can ask a little question. Whether the attacks of 9/11 had any particular effect on immigration in the United States and Canada?
They had a big impact in the United States. You may recall immediately in the period after 9/11, there was, you know, basically a ban on immigration of males from Middle Eastern particular countries. I mean, you can actually see there's a repeat of that under Trump, right, in terms of the Muslim ban, which closely corresponds actually to what happened right after 9/11. Canada, interestingly enough, did not follow suit. There is some overlap in terms of the smart border accords that have been struck between the United States and Canada in terms of a kind of a militarization of the border and a higher security agenda. But in terms of targeting, Muslim immigrants from Arab countries, we don't see the same here. And we do see that. We did see that in the US and also in European countries. And I've mentioned Muslims a lot because it is such a big political issue in Europe.
Thank you.
Professor Ellermann, thank you for an absolutely fascinating and informative evening. I learned so much tonight, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. Thank you for giving us your time tonight to do this and to put the presentation together. I wish I was younger. I would take your course, one of your courses for sure.
Never old.
Well, thank you so much. I actually, one funny thing I should tell you is that I was surprised to see so many women among you. I thought it was going to be all men. So it's fantastic to see.
Well, you know, with the Zoom and the situation with the pandemic and so on, early on, very early on, a couple of years ago, we decided to open it to everyone, and it was the right move for sure. And this way we can all connect as a community.
Yeah, no, it was a very warm room. I really appreciated all of you being here, and thank you for your engagement.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone else for joining us tonight. Michael Geller, our good friend, will be back for a repeat performance next month in April. And I wish everyone to stay safe and stay well. And good evening. Thank you, Antje.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay, we'll see you next